Good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Weinstein. As Laura mentioned, I'm a senior product manager here at Learn on Demand Systems. And today what we're going to be talking about is replicating your on-premise infrastructure inside of Sandbox virtual environments. So there's a lot of reasons that you might want to do this. We're going to talk about some of the reasons that you might consider doing this, as well as some of the best practices when doing so. So infrastructure components, some of those common on-prem resources that you might be familiar with, some of these may actually kind of escape you when you're thinking about building these types of resources in the cloud. Obviously, from a compute perspective, you've got virtual machines. We support and we can handle Hyper-V as a platform, VMware, and Docker containers. Linux and Windows operating systems are available for use in the platform. For networking, complex networking environments are fully supported. You can create your own virtual switches. You can have isolated networks, maybe for back-end traffic for security reasons, for privacy reasons. And maybe you want to create a management network or have some type of internal routing inside of your environment. We also offer public networking so that those instances that need public IP addresses and can be accessible from the internet are fully supported. For storage, some of the things that a lot of people seem to forget about when they're replicating an environment like this, having your private data stores as well as your databases secured and on the back end, not available for public consumption. And then lastly, some of the shared services that are very common in on-prem environments, things like Active Directory, Microsoft Exchange or email servers, document collaboration solutions such as Microsoft SharePoint, and security tool sets that you might want to use for intrusion detection and protection. If you're trying to create capture the flag or a security testing scenario. All of these things, when you start thinking about building a sandboxed environment, for whatever reason, you need to make sure that you include all of the elements that would be required for such a solution to be virtualized. So why would you want to replicate in a sandbox, right? One of the common uses that we see here are product demonstrations. Maybe you want to do a sales demonstration of a software product. Right? Many software products are not as simple as just having an application. It's an application that has to have complex backends. Again, we can take something like Microsoft SharePoint, for example. A Microsoft SharePoint environment requires Active Directory servers. It requires Microsoft SQL servers. It requires application servers, web servers. Special processing servers. There's a lot that happens on the back end in order to be able to do an effective demonstration of a platform like SharePoint. Maybe you want to have environments where you can allow customers to do product trials. So instead of the customer having to build an environment in their on-premise environment, maybe you want to be able to provide a completely installed solution, maybe even including data sets that can be used for a product demonstration or a product trial. All of that can be set up ahead of time, and then you can provide that customer with a fully running live environment in just a matter of moments. Performing customer needs assessments, right? So that you can go in and provide an environment and see maybe you've got different levels of a specific product, right? Trying to find out if the product is going to actually meet the customer's needs. For application training, for both employee and customer training, maybe you've got a software product and you can you want to be able to provide training for the customer. Instead of that customer having to train and potentially break their on-premise environment that's been set up, you can provide training in a ready-to-go sandbox solution that's already been set up for that purpose. Maybe you need to employ training, provide employee training on a new application. Maybe you've got a new, intranet application, or a new application that your employees, for your customer service reps, need to learn how to use. You can create a completely sandboxed environment for training purposes. And then doing training for proprietary software. Maybe you've got a solution that is not available publicly. It's available only internally, that you need to be able to train people on. And then for development and testing, right? This can be very important in implementing a CI, a continuous integration, continuous delivery, or a CI/CD platform for DevOps when you're doing software development, right? Testing new versions, performing, A/B testing of different software applications. Maybe you want to do integration testing to make sure that the new versions of your software will interact with the other components that are in your environment. Maybe you want to do performance testing, what's typically called canary testing, so that you can see how application version 2 performs as compared to application number 1. Right, performing version evaluations, seeing which version of a software package might fit the need and be a better solution for you. So with all of these scenarios, instead of performing this in a production environment, you have the ability to spin up a pre-configured sandboxed environment. So maybe your environment has complex networking needs. Maybe you need, 4 Windows servers, 2 Windows clients, a database server with Active Directory. All of that can be pre-built, pre-populated. So whenever you need to execute or launch the environment, it takes just a few simple minutes to start up. You use the environment. You can then tear that environment down, and all changes basically get erased, right? So you can't, make a mistake, which is going to, affect that environment going forward, right? So here's an example of a Windows infrastructure. Now, as you can see over on the right-hand side, this is a screenshot of our platform when you do have multiple servers inside of the platform. You have the ability to switch in between servers. So maybe you want to issue some commands on a Windows client. For other commands, you might need to go and switch over to a Windows server. Again, we do support Windows. We also support all the different flavors of Linux. We also support Docker containers. So you could have, for example, you could have a lab here which has some Windows and some Linux instances where the user could switch in between the different instance types. But in this example here, right, this would feature private networking. So all of your Active Directory servers, your SQL servers, your application servers could be on a virtualized private network that is not accessible from anywhere except inside of this virtual environment. It basically is able to isolate all of your traffic in between all of your instances and nodes. But maybe you need public networking for things like web servers. Obviously, you've got to be able to have public web connectivity if you're testing web servers. Maybe you want to, be testing remote access through remote access server in Windows and use RDP connectivity, for example. But this could be a good example of when you need to do infrastructure training, training users on things like Active Directory, Active Directory replication, maybe Windows backup scenarios. Maybe you need to do training on Windows Server. Or maybe you're trying to build a security training solution, to train your security personnel on how to be able to prevent against things like distributed denial of service attacks and potential hacker attacks against your environment. Another use for this is for big data solutions. So many of you this may be new to some of you. Some of you might know how this works. In big data solutions, typically big data solutions take a very long time. They're very complex, and they can take a very long time to set up and initialize. So as an example here, we've got a Hadoop cluster. A Hadoop cluster typically is 2 or more nodes that split up very large data sets and then splits the processing between these data sets, or excuse me, between the nodes inside of your Hadoop cluster. There's also typically a cluster controller as well as a proxy server that works with this. And then you typically have some type of database system or something that's providing data to the Hadoop cluster. So in this case, once again, you would use a private network for things like your database servers and all of your Hadoop servers to live on, but then a public network for the cluster control and the ability to remote into a machine to perform job execution. So why would you want to do this? Again, setting up a Hadoop cluster is it can consume a lot of time. It's very, very complex. In addition to that, it is complex to maintain. So what most organizations that need Hadoop are going to do is typically, if they set this up in an on-prem environment, they're going to be setting up quite a few machines. Those machines are going to be running 24/7 with this Hadoop software. Because of the amount of time it takes to set up an environment like this, it's very convenient to have an environment that you can simply stand up when you need to use it and then tear it down when you're done with it. So if you're doing any type of big data development, if you're experimenting with the different languages that you use in Hadoop, whether it be Apache Spark or Hive or Pig, there's a slew of languages. There's a lot of different business intelligence tools, right? You might want to be able to evaluate different BI tools for your organization to see what type of queries, and this goes into our next point, which is query optimization. What type of queries are you going to use? What type of queries do these big data solutions use? How can you optimize those queries to get better performance? And then also being able to have a Hadoop cluster that you can spin up to perform interactive queries against, right? So the cluster has to be up and online in order to perform a query against that cluster. If it takes days to set up a Hadoop cluster, it doesn't make a lot of sense. And this is why a lot of organizations don't use Hadoop solutions, because they don't want to dedicate those resources to doing that. There's another scenario here where you might want to do training against big data solutions. Companies that have machine learning, right? Which we all know machine learning is becoming more and more popular these days with artificial intelligence. Some of these data sets can be in the petabytes in size. So maybe what you want to do is be able to provide an environment that has preloaded data sets for people to be able to analyze and to perform queries against. This is another reason that you might want to be able to spin up an infrastructure environment like this, be able to perform queries or allow users, maybe potential clients, or employees that you're training to use these big data solutions, maybe your data scientists, need an environment to be able to train in and use for these interactive Hadoop queries, right? Application testing, right? This can also meet your complex networking requirements. This could be used for software testing. Again, your system integration tests, validating your migration plans for cloud migrations. One of my specialties is cloud services. And when performing a migration to the cloud, it is typically a months-long process building a migration plan. Well, one of the last things that you want to do is to build a migration plan and then test it against your production environments. It is always recommended that you perform some tests before you go to implement a very large migration plan, right? Test the conversion of your Hyper-V or your VMware virtual machines. Test the conversion process to make sure that all of your conversion tools work properly, that you can update that information and upload that information, get it to the cloud, make sure that it's successful. Test the migration of your databases, right? Make sure that you have no data loss. These are all things that you should test before you plan on a full cloud migration. So testing these applications, again, it could be a scenario where you need an environment for developers to be able to develop applications for your organization. You want to give them a snapshot environment to be able to develop against. One of the common mistakes that is commonly used, and this goes into our first best practice here, is that you want to make sure that your sandboxed environment closely resembles your on-prem environment. So for example, let's say that you're testing, and I'll just throw out as an example, let's say testing Microsoft Exchange Server, right? And you're testing Microsoft Exchange Server, but your sandboxed environment only has 5 users in Active Directory. Well, obviously that Exchange environment is going to perform much differently than in your production environment where you may have 150,000 users. So you always want to make sure that your sandboxed environment closely resembles production. So this way, when your developers are working, let's say in Visual Studio, and they're developing against your environment, instead of having to develop against your production environment on-prem, you can give them this sandboxed environment, right? So that if for some reason there's any mistakes, any problems with their code, it doesn't affect any production resources. Plus, it gives you the ability to snapshot back, right? So if for some reason there was a problem with the code, maybe it corrupts a database or it corrupts your Active Directory, you can simply just return that environment back to a known state and then be right back where you started. So it can be used as a safety, the safety net, if you will, for your developers to develop against. In addition, for your developers, right, you can provide them with development workstations that are built that have all of the tools that they need already installed. Maybe it's tools that your organization has standardized on. Maybe you want to make sure that they're using a specific version of Visual Studio with the Team Foundation server tools. You want to make sure that they they don't have to go and on their laptop, for example, they don't have to go and install Visual Studio. They don't have to install all, Microsoft SQL Server Express Edition, and then all of the libraries and components that they would be using. Instead, they can just use the sandbox environment where all of those tools are already installed and pre-configured. They simply log into the sandbox environment. They then perform the tasks that they need to do. And then when they're done, they can basically exit out of that environment. Right. This can also be used in training scenarios as an FYI. This can also be used for coder training, right? So maybe you want to make sure that a bit of source code is going to perform a specific function. You can use our activity-based assessments and our performance-based testing to be able to verify that code execution does what it needs to against the remote environment. A security infrastructure example, right? One of the things that we do, we've got one of our services for our product is what we called shared labs. The security infrastructure example is an example of that. In this case, we would have one shared lab environment, right? So this shared lab environment can have, a multitude of servers and resources on the back end. It could have intrusion detection and protection systems involved, possibly, custom routing or load balancing solutions. In this example, we've got 3 virtual machines and then 2 different networks, one internal and one external built. But then we have 2 participant profiles. The blue machines are on the domain. So they're joined to the Active Directory domain, they're on the internal network, and these are where your security personnel would be involved with being able to make sure that they can protect all of the resources on the corporate network. The red machines, on the other hand, contain hacking tools, right? So then you've got some other security personnel that are acting as bad actors, if you will, and trying to hack onto the internal environment, so that you can have this custom sandboxed environment to be able to test your security team's readiness for an attack, so they can practice on how to defend against those attacks. And you can, in a way, I guess you're kind of gamifying, a security instance. This is very common for things like capture the flag scenarios, where you're doing game day exercises or real-time exercises, and keeping, you can use it obviously for testing different tools, but also for keeping the skills of your security teams up to date with the latest zero-day attacks, and making sure that they're ready to defend should an attack occur against your environment. So as you can see, there's a lot of different ways and a lot of different reasons that you might want to create these sandbox virtual environments. It is very, very common that we get customers all the time that come to us, especially for product demonstrations, product evaluations, and for training, right? That's kind of where we've been set with this, but the possibilities are actually endless when it comes to building these infrastructure examples, and replicating your on-prem environments in the LOD platform. So with that, do we have any questions? Anything that I left out that anybody would like to see? I tell you what, I actually have, just as an example here, go and stand by 1 second and I'll pull this up. Here's a lab profile just as an example, where you can see this is for an enterprise voice application, right? And you can see when we go down here and look at this particular lab environment has 4 separate networks on it. And then we can see that this one is using 13 separate virtual machines. So by clicking Start Lab here, we're going to spin up no less than 13 virtual machines. In this example, the user would be utilizing enterprise voice applications over these private networks, so that you can test, the PBX functionality, the voicemail functionality, typically for something like a Skype for Business type scenario.